Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, where we discuss some of the best moments, best names, and best memories in sports history. I'm your host, Dana Augusta, and I'm back again with another show highlighting the best in sports history, and I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to hear what's going on in the world of sports history. And as a reminder, please subscribe to this podcast if you like what you hear here, and check out our Twitter page at HistoricallySP2 for your daily dose of sports history. And on today's show, I sit down with co-host of Hello Old Sports podcast, Dan Neumann, as we discuss the greatest debut of a franchise in major pro sports history. A team that would become legendary and a dynasty in the true sense of the word. Also this week will be the top 5 history-making performances and events that celebrated anniversaries this past week, as well as a shout-out going to my favorite team and the reasons why I was drawn to them. So sit back and enjoy the show. This is Historically Speaking Sports Podcast from the Sports History Network.
The Pigskin Tales Podcast is all about the lesser-known pro football players. Yes, there are stories about the ones we know, like Brad Tarkenton and Harold Red Grange. But have you ever heard of Ernie Nevers? How about Dave Osborne or even Grady Alderman? These men created their own path to the NFL. How did they do it? Listen to the Pigskin Tales Podcast, now streaming on your favorite music platform. Go to pigskintales.com.
Hello and welcome back to this episode of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, and I am your host, Dana Augusta, and today I have a very special guest on board with us, and a man by the name of Daniel Neumann. He is the host of Hello Again Sports, and we're going to be talking about today what I consider one of the greatest debuts of a franchise, maybe in any sport, you know, and we're talking about, of course, the Cleveland Browns of 1950. Now, you got to remember, the Browns were a member of the All-American Football Conference, and they were a dominant team during that time, winning 4 championships of that actually every championship that franchise have ever gave out. Coached by the legendary Paul Brown, they had Otto Graham, Marion Motley, and the list goes on and on. They debuted against the Eagles in 1950, September 16th, exactly, of 1950. And we're going to take it away. We're going to let Daniel talk a little bit more about it. Dan, great to have you aboard, man.
Thanks so much for having me, Dana. Really glad I get the chance to do this. And this is a really cool moment in sports history, because it's kind of the first and really the only time where a team from a rival league joined a much more longer established league and came in and started kicking butt almost right away.
You're right. I mean, let's do a little backstory of both of them. First, you have Cleveland, who I've mentioned before was members of the All-American Football Conference, and they were not the only team to come into the NFL from that league.
Yeah, the other was San Francisco, right?
Yeah, the 49ers came in right with them. And there was the Baltimore Colts, but it wasn't the Colts that we know of. It was a precursor to the ones that we know of. That this team, I think Colts team lasted like maybe a couple years, and then they folded and then they came back. But the 49ers and the Browns were two of the mainstays of that league that came into the NFL.
Yeah, and they both sort of became identified as, classic NFL teams. And when I first started learning about this, it's funny too, especially with the Browns, because they were one of the teams in 1960, and I guess it would have been in 1970 when the AFL and NFL merged. The Browns went over to the AFC. So they're kind of the only team that's been, AAFC, NFL, and then, obviously they stayed in the NFL, but then they were part of the AFC, which was made up almost entirely of former AFL teams. So you don't realize what an interesting history that franchise has had, especially when, and it was funny, I was just actually talking about this last night with my wife. We were watching a video of Calvin Johnson being inducted into the Hall of Fame this past year. And I was talking just about how, kind of, no offense to any Lions fans out there, but what a sad team the Lions have been for the last 60 or so years. And they're one of the only teams that's been in the league the whole time that hasn't made the Super Bowl. The other one is the Browns. And so you always think of the Browns as this kind of inept franchise that, had winless seasons and was never any good and left the city for Baltimore and then had to get an expansion team. And then you don't realize that from 46 to sometime in the late 50s, early 60s, they were one of the premier teams in both the AAFC and then later in the NFL. It's crazy.
You're right, because you think about it, they dominated in the AAFC in the 1940s. They come to the NFL and pretty much become a dynasty right off the bat in the early 1950s. And then you get Jim Brown in the 1960s, and then it keeps going. They win the championship in 64. They become a perennial playoff team throughout the early 70s. Mm-hmm. Then there was a brief period of, mediocrity. Then in the early 80s with Brian Sipe and the Cardiac Kids, and then later on with Bernie Kosar and the two playoff losses that they suffered to the Broncos in the AFC Championship games in 86 and 87. Mm-hmm. This is a team that has been pretty much for a lot of the younger millennial fans out there, who I pick on a lot. The Browns was a dominant franchise for years and years and years throughout the entire history of the NFL, from the time they entered in 1950 to pretty much to maybe the early 90s. They were a dominant franchise, and then everything fell apart in the mid 90s.
Yeah, and they just never been able to make it back to that Super Bowl, since the Super Bowl started. But there's a lot of history there.
Yeah, exactly. But we also talked about the Browns winning the championship and winning the AAFC championship 4 consecutive years in the 1940s. They joined the NFL. And their first game out the bat is against the defending NFL champion Philadelphia Eagles in Philly. Now, setting up the situation, the game was on a Saturday night. The first game of the year, Saturday night. That's basically like what the NFL does now, having the Super Bowl champion play on Thursday night. Well, this year, in this particular instance, in 1950, the Eagles was the defending NFL champs. They were supposed to basically run roughshod through this new team from this league that was, I guess, maybe was considered minor league at the time. At least that's what maybe some proponents of the NFL was thinking at the time. We'll talk more about that.
Yeah, it's funny. They were formed in 1946, the All-America Football Conference, the AAFC, and they were actually founded by a guy, or not, they were one of the guys who founded it. I shouldn't give him the sole credit, was a guy by the name of Arch Ward, who was a Chicago sports writer. And Arch Ward is kind of an interesting guy. Even though he was just a writer, he was never an executive. He never was in any sort of league leadership position. In addition to sort of providing the impetus and bringing the people together to found the AAFC, he previously was the inventor of the Golden Gloves boxing, which is well known even to this day. And he also was the guy who in the 1930s had the idea for the very first MLB All-Star game, which was played in Chicago in 1933. Babe Ruth hit the first home run, whatever. So he sort of, I think it was a bunch of owners who had wanted to get into the NFL and had, for whatever reason, been not welcome in doing so. And so he brought these teams together in the AAFC, and it was a lot of arenas that, or a lot of cities, I should say, that didn't necessarily have, not only did they not have football, but they didn't have professional sports at all. So Buffalo Bisons and the Miami Seahawks, San Francisco.
I love that name, by the way, the Miami Seahawks. I love that name.
Yeah, it's kind of weird to hear when because we think of the Seahawks in football as being something else. Mm-hmm. But it's all these cities, and then there are some teams, some rivals. There's two teams in New York. He kind of follows baseball a little bit. He's got a New York Yankees that play at Yankee Stadium and a Brooklyn Dodgers that play at Ebbets Field. And you got, the Chicago Rockets. I think the thing that's probably most noteworthy is two teams in California, because you had the Los Angeles Dons and the San Francisco 49ers. Now, there was a team in LA. There was the Rams in the NFL who had just moved there a few years previously, actually from Cleveland. From Cleveland, right. Yeah. And so, but it was the first league to really put teams on, more than one team on the West Coast. The Giants and Dodgers were a few years away in baseball. Lakers wouldn't get out to LA until the late 1950s. And so it was the first time that you'd had two rival teams on the West Coast, and that rivalry was a big part of what made the AAFC so great. Now, I think it did have some of the challenges of a new league. You had a lot of teams that only lasted for a year or two and then had to fold. You had teams that had to move from one city to another. So, well, it's not entirely, you shouldn't entirely dismiss what the Browns did in those 4 years, and they proved themselves in the NFL later on. I think it is fair to say that talent-wise, they were head and shoulders above any of the other teams in the AFC, and that accounted for a lot of their success.
That's right. And then you have the Eagles, who were like I said, the defending NFL champion. It was before the Super Bowl, but they were the defending NFL champs. They defeated the Rams in the 1949 NFL championship game in the Coliseum, and they were a prohibitive favorite against this new team. Talk about that Eagles team from the late 1940s. They had won back-to-back NFL titles at the time.
Back-to-back NFL titles. Their best player was a running back by the name of Steve Van Buren. And my father's family grew up my father too. My father, I'm from New York, but my father grew up until his teenage years in Philadelphia, and his whole family was from Philly. And my grandfather, who was not a huge football fan, but had, been around the sport growing up, Steve Van Buren was always like the name that he brought up, that he remembered hearing about and knowing about as a kid. He's in the Hall of Fame. Was a member of the NFL 100th anniversary team. He was probably their best player, but they also had guys like Pete Pihos, who was a great running back, great wide receiver, tight end type of guy. So just a really good team. And they had won, coached by another Hall of Famer, a guy by the name of Greasy Neal. They had won back-to-back championships. They had shut out their opponents in both the 48 and the 49 NFL title game. You mentioned 49 against the Rams out in LA. 48 might have been even more impressive. They beat the Chicago Cardinals 7-0, and this was a rematch of the previous year when they had lost to the Cardinals in Chicago 28-21. Mm-hmm. But in 48, they beat the Cardinals 7-0 at Shibe Park in Philly about a week before Christmas. And I'm looking here at the attendance. There was a paid attendance at this game of 36,000, but an actual attendance of only 28,000. And that means about 8,000 people who bought tickets to this game didn't show up. And there's a really good reason for this. And even if you don't realize it, most NFL fans have probably seen a clip of this game. This game was played in a driving blizzard. Probably one of the snowiest games, at least one of the snowiest big games in NFL history. I always think back to, I think it was like 1993 when the Cowboys and Dolphins played on Thanksgiving in Dallas, and there was a snowstorm, and Leon led at the end with the field goal. But this was, picture that type of snow, doubled or tripled. In fact, Steve Van Buren before this game had just assumed that it would be canceled, and was later called by his teammates or something saying, "Where are you?" And he couldn't get his car out and had to take the streetcar into downtown Philly to go to the game. And so they had just come off winning this back-to-back titles, and they were considered the best team in the NFL, and Greasy Neal was considered one of the best coaches in the NFL going into the 49 season, and they were the pride of the NFL. And I'm sure that part of the reason why Bert Bell, the commissioner, now I'm sure even then part of it was eyeballs, whether he wanted to get people in the stadium, which he did. They had 72,000 people at this game, or fans listening on the radio, or even, there was very early days of TV then. I'm sure that was a big part of it. But I also think that Bert Bell, the commissioner, probably wanted to start the season with the pride of the NFL giving a smack to these upstart AAFC Browns.
Yeah, you mentioned Greasy Neal was the coach of the Eagles, and of course the legendary Paul Brown was the coach of the Cleveland Browns. And the game was played instead of it playing at Shibe Park, which was the Eagles' home during that time, they played the game at Municipal Stadium, which was a temporary home for the Eagles. They would travel back and forth between Shibe Park and Municipal Stadium. This game was played at Municipal Stadium because I think maybe that the Phillies might have had a game that night, or the Athletics might have had a game that night there. So the game was moved to Municipal Stadium, and instead of the Eagles delivering a smackdown, it was the Browns giving a smackdown to the Eagles in one of the most improbable and one of the most incredible debuts for a franchise in NFL history.
Those who listen to my podcast, to our podcast, know that my brother he's a Philly. I mean, he knows more Philly than I do because he went to school in Philly for 4 years, and he's also an Army football season ticket holder. One of the interesting things about Municipal Stadium is it was later, after President Kennedy was killed, it was actually renamed JFK, John F. Kennedy Stadium, and remained in existence all the way into the late 1970s, but basically starting at some point in the 60s, basically hosted nothing except the Army-Navy game. So for about 20 years, this stadium was there, and all it did was host Army-Navy every year, and then maybe, high school football or track meets or whatever. But so that's sort of just an interesting factoid about Municipal Stadium that later became JFK Stadium. But you're right, this is a big event. This is, in some ways, it kind of reminds me more of something you see in college football, where to kick off the season, you have this big game between two really good teams on a prime time on a Saturday night type of thing. And
at
it's
a neutral
kind of
site type of thing, but this wasn't really a neutral site, right?
Not a neutral site, but maybe a bigger arena, bigger stadium, that type of thing. And this is such a big deal that, again, Bert Bell, the commissioner, he decides that they're going to name an MVP of this game. Now, I don't know exactly what that MVP ended up getting, and it ends up being Otto Graham, unsurprisingly, the best quarterback of the era. But such a big deal, so much hype around this game. And I think, the Eagles, Greasy Neal later says that they scout, they watch, game film was in existence in those days. They watched the game film, but he later said it just didn't prepare them. First of all, the Browns had been lucky enough to add some new players from some of the defunct AAFC teams. They had added 6 players from former AAFC teams that had not made the jump over into the NFL. And he later said, that this was not even the Browns of last year. This was essentially an AAFC all-star team. And so they end up beating them pretty handily by a score of 35-10.
Yeah, 35-10. I have some of the stats here. Well, let me give you a little quick rundown. The Eagles actually scored first in that game on a field goal by Cliff Patton. And then next thing you know, the Browns scored 28 unanswered points. And by midway through the fourth quarter, the Browns were up 28-3. And I know people in Philadelphia that was expecting this, this runaway. They got one, but it was in a way that they didn't expect. Paul Brown has always been known as one of the most influential and one of the most innovative coaches in the history of football, and that was on full display that night. I mean, you look at Otto Graham's stats from that night, he went 21 of 38 for 346 yards. I mean, that's numbers that you wouldn't see on a regular basis until like maybe the 1980s, but he was throwing the ball all over the lot. And I know that the Eagles, being part of the NFL, was not used to anything like that.
Yeah, one of probably, other than Graham, the best player on the Cleveland Browns was Marion Motley, who was both a running back, a fullback, although in those days fullbacks carried the ball a lot more than they do today. Motley, along with Bill Willis, had been two of the four players that reintegrated professional football in 1946. It was two players on the Browns and then two players on the LA Rams in the NFL. One of whose names was, I believe, Vitamin Smith, and the other one escapes me at the moment.
Kenny Washington.
I'm sorry? Kenny Washington, right? Yep, that's right. Exactly. So anyway, Motley was the guy on the team. He was again, other than Graham, the biggest offensive weapon. And so Neal and the Eagles, they prepared to stop Motley.
Right.
And Brown being Brown, he decides that what they're going to do is basically not run the ball almost at all in the first 2.5 or 3 quarters. He has two Hall of Fame wide receivers, Dante Lavelli, and also another gentleman by the name of Max Speedy, who Speedy actually just was inducted into the Hall of Fame last year. Well, technically he was inducted this year because of the COVID-related delay in the induction, but Max Speedy was a guy who actually eventually was sort of blackballed from professional football because he jumped to the Canadian League, and it was always sort of thought that the reason why it took Speedy 70 years after his retirement to get into the Hall of Fame was that Paul Brown, the grudge of the late Paul Brown, existed even into the 21st century. Nonetheless, Brown uses these two Hall of Fame receivers and his Hall of Fame quarterback in Graham, basically doesn't give the ball to Motley at all in the first 3 quarters, wears him down. Graham throws a touchdown pass to Lavelli. He throws a touchdown pass to Speedy. He throws another touchdown pass to a gentleman by the name of, I think it was Dub Jones. I don't know if you have the box score in front of you there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he does. Dub Jones actually caught the very first touchdown pass. It was a 59-yarder from Graham. And Dub Jones, if people don't really realize, Dub Jones is the father of future NFL All-Pro quarterback Burt Jones.
I didn't know that. I did not know
that.
Being
from Louisiana, we know a lot about Burt Jones, and me being an LSU fan, it's Burt Jones' dad. So,
yeah.
But
wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, Dub Jones is the father and was a longtime scout for the Browns, and he actually, as a side note, tried to persuade the Cleveland Browns to trade up in the 1971 draft to get Archie Manning.
Mm-hmm. So, oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. So that's what you have there. You have, Dub Jones catches the first touchdown pass. Lavelli catches a 26-yard touchdown pass from Graham in the second quarter, and Max Speedy catches another touchdown pass from Graham in the third. So you have all three of those guys catching passes from Otto Graham, who I consider to be one of the greatest quarterbacks that no one talks about. Mm-hmm. No one talks about how. I mean, you imagine a quarterback that leads his team to the Super Bowl 9 consecutive years. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what Otto Graham did. Okay, if you combine what he did in the AAFC to what he did in the NFL, you combine the two, he basically led his team to a championship game appearance in 9 consecutive years.
Yeah,
which is impressive. And you talked about Motley. Motley only had 11 carries for 48 yards.
I'd be willing to bet if you looked and broke that down, probably 2/3 of that were in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, he's trying to run down the clock. Mm-hmm. Pete Pio, like you said earlier, was the only touchdown reception for Philly, but that wasn't until late in the fourth quarter when the game was well out of hand.
I think it should also be noted that Van Buren was hurt for this game.
Yeah, he was.
Now, I don't know what the nature of the injury was, and they asked Neal afterwards, would you guys have won if Van Buren had been in the lineup, and he said no. He said we might have scored a couple more touchdowns, but we would not have won the game. So Greasy Neal came away thoroughly impressed with the team that had just beaten his. And then the Browns they do go on to win. They win the title in 50. They beat another really good team of the era. They beat the 1950, the LA Rams with the two-headed monster at quarterback of Van Brocklin and Bob Waterfield, and the two Hall of Fame receivers in Crazy Legs Hirsch and Tom Fears. So yeah, this was the beginning of, or the continuance, depending on how you want to look at it, of a dominant decade for the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, I mean, you think about those Browns teams in the 50s, you know, you had like really good teams all across the lot between the Browns, and you got to, again, millennial fans that's listening, the Browns and Lions were two of the dominant teams of that era, of the early 1950s. The Browns would win, they won it in 53 and 54, I think it was, or 52 and 53. I knew they won two in the early 50s.
I think
they won another in 57, which was their last NFL title. Yep. And then you have the Browns intermixed in between them, winning championships. In fact, the Browns-Lions rivalry started when them constantly meeting up in NFL championship games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the Bobby Lane Lions of the 50s.
Bobby Lane was Schmidt was the middle linebacker. I don't know if he was there at the time, but Night Train Lane was there.
Yep.
You had a lot of really good hard nose. I mean, you talk about a hardcore, old school football, smash mouth type of football. That was the Lions of the 50s. And meanwhile, the Browns was like the vision of the future.
Yep.
Of the NFL, with the passing and Paul Brown's innovations, everything from the face mask to shuttling plays in from the sidelines. I mean, everything that the Browns did was like years ahead of their time.
He put a lot more emphasis than most coaches of the day on the mental part of the game. Mm-hmm. I was reading in preparation for this that his team wouldn't even practice on Mondays and Tuesdays. They would just do, film sessions or blackboard work or that type of thing. And that was sort of his view of football, was that it was a physical game, sure, but there was a mental piece of it that was really being underemphasized. And the other thing I think it's worth noting about him is the flexibility. He was one of the guys, I think it used to be more the coach would kind of get the team riled up and he'd make sure they practice and make sure they knew the plays, and then just kind of send them out there. In fact, in this game, the Eagles come out running a 5-4 defense, which is like something you'd see in Pop Warner football these days, with 5 defensive linemen and 4 linebackers and only 2 defensive backs. And even with Graham throwing the ball to Jones and Lavelli and Speedy and throwing it all over the field, Greasy Neal very stubbornly refuses to come out of this 5-4 defense. Right. So they're able to keep throwing. And I think that speaks to how Brown was sort of a step ahead, even from other Hall of Fame coaches like Greasy Neal. So yeah, he later kind of wore out his welcome, I think, in Cleveland. He had a lot of conflicts and clashes with Art Modell, and then went to Cincinnati and he did all right and didn't really do all that much. But yeah, I mean, everybody from Bill Belichick to Bill Walsh to you name it speaks of Paul Brown. I mean, I'm pretty sure Walsh even later coached for Brown in Cincinnati.
It was Bill Walsh coached the quarterbacks, and he was the one who developed the West Coast offense under Brown. Though he did learn the elements or the rudiments of the West Coast offense from, believe it or not, Al Davis.
Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
And you mentioned just now about how Greasy Neal didn't refuse to get out of that 5-4 defense. It's a lot like, and you hear the saying all the time that if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. Uh-huh. In Super Bowl IV with the Vikings and Chiefs, the Vikings refused to get out of a certain defense that they were in, and Dawson just tore them apart with just short passes. And Bud Grant just refused to get out of that defense, basically saying, we're going to play this way, and if we die this way, we're just going to die this way. And that's basically what happened. They played a certain defense against Dawson and the Chiefs in Super Bowl IV and did not get out of that defense at all. And for whatever reason, Bud Grant said, no, we're not getting out of the defense. We still could win with this, and basically got blasted. So you see that often in not only in football but in sports, where a team gets to the biggest dance of the year and they live and die by the old adage, you dance with who brought you. But for some reason, the coaches were just stubborn. They basically are, because I'm a nephew of a coach. So, so the coaches are just stubborn, and, that's just the way it was. And Greasy Neal was another example of, we played this defense, we're playing a 5-4, and guess what? We're not getting out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. We should also mention that we talked a lot about the offense, but that Browns defense was pretty good themselves. And this was sort of, I think, one of the points that Greasy Neal made. Now, Motley, it's always kind of hard to assess these guys from back then, because usually guys who played both are better known for offense. So Motley was a linebacker also, and a very good linebacker, but not an all-time great linebacker. He was an all-time great running back. But they did have two guys on defense that are in the Hall of Fame based mostly on their defensive prowess, and that's Bill Willis, who we talked about a minute ago, who was what they called a middle guard in those days with a 5-man defensive line. And then it had a defensive end by the name of Len Ford, who was another Hall of Famer, and he had not been on the team in the AAFC. He had been with the Los Angeles Dons, the LA AAFC team. And then as part of that, I guess you'd almost call it an expansion draft in reverse, as part of that dispersal.
Dispersal draft, right.
Yeah, where all these teams got to pick old AAFC players. They ended up with Len Ford, who is in himself a Hall of Fame defensive end. So think about this team that had barely lost a game in 4 years in the AAFC, and then they're bringing in a Hall of Fame defensive end. So, and there were other guys on that team, that 1950 Colts, or I'm sorry, 1950 Colts, that 1950 Browns defense. But I think those are the three guys, including Motley, who made it to the Hall of Fame. And Graham had played some defensive back in his days. They had a tackle by the name of Luke Rosa, who played both offense and defense, but he's actually better known, and he's in the Hall of Fame. He's better known as a kicker. Yeah. So lots of Hall of Famers all over the place, but the offense, especially in this game, scoring 35 points, gets the lion's share of the attention. But it's worth noting that they had some really good defensive players, Hall of Famers as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talked about Len Ford a little bit in a past podcast that I had, when I highlighted players that were in the Hall of Fame that came from historical Black colleges and universities. Len Ford came from Morgan State, and he played tight end. While he was at Morgan State, he played tight end and defensive end, but he's in the Hall of Fame for the Browns as a defensive end. And you're right, he started off with the LA Dons of the AAFC. Yeah.
So you always wonder if players, whether it's the Packers of the 60s, the Steelers of the 70s. My brother and I always talk in a different sport about the Boston Celtics of the 50s and 60s, about how you look at some of these rosters for some of these years, and you got 8 or 9 Hall of Famers on a roster. And, even in the NFL, guys from those teams, some of those dynasties are still going in. We talked about Speedy
Mike Speedy, right.
Donnie Shell got in from the Steelers this year. And, Jerry Kramer got in from Green Bay a couple years ago. So even 50, 60, 70 years later, more and more players from these dynasties keep going in. And you wonder sometimes if maybe some of them are getting in because they were on those teams and that helps their case, or were these teams so good because they had all these guys that were Hall of Famers? It's probably a little bit of both. But I
think it is a little bit of both. Yeah. You're right.
So it's funny to look back though and just see, it's like, wow, there's a ton of Hall of Famers on this team. And they also had a guy by the name of, and I'm blanking on his name, but somebody from the Saban family, I believe, was on that team I think it was Nick Saban's father by the name of Lou Saban was a defensive back on that team for a couple years, if I'm remembering correctly.
Right. Okay.
He was there the entire AAFC time. He was there from 46 to 49. So another guy who, in some sort of weird, convoluted way, is part of the Paul Brown coaching tree.
So, I mean, when you talk about Paul Brown's coaching tree, you start off with start off with Walsh, and you have so many people. The coach that was the successor of Paul Brown, Blanton Collier, who was on that staff. Weave Eubank was on that staff. Who later coached the Colts through the 58 title, and then of course the Jets in Super Bowl III. He was on that staff. So, and then all of the people that came from those guys, like with Weave Eubank, who was on that staff. He produced Buddy Ryan. And
actually, Don Shula played for those Paul Brown teams in the early 50s for a couple years. So there's another one. Yeah. No, it's a fun team. I read a book about 15 years ago, and that was when you said you were looking for somebody to join you for this. I kind of jumped on it because there's a book called The Best Show in Football by a guy by the name of Andy Piasek, about this whole sort of 46 to 55 dynasty. And it really, it's it's a fun team. It's a fun story. It's a fun era in pro football when things were just sort of starting to modernize a little bit in many different ways, whether it's media, whether it's expansion, whether it's just the style of play on the field. So it really is kind of a fun era, and they're kind of the first dynasty of any real note in the history of professional football. And it's just, they're fun. They're a fun team to remember and talk about.
That's right. And yes, right. Millennials, the Cleveland Browns were once good.
Exactly.
They're getting better now, but once upon a time, the Browns were good, as well as the Lions. A little quick shout out to our partner. That's a Lions fan.
Arnie. Yep, absolutely.
A quick shout out to him. So, but anyway, Dan, I really appreciate you coming on with me today and talk about what you guys got coming up on y'all podcast.
Sure. Yeah. So it's Hello Old Sports, and it's co-hosted between my brother and I, my brother Andrew. And we, for those of you who haven't heard an episode, we're both from New York. He went to school in Philly. I went to school in Boston, and now I live in DC, and he lived in DC for a little bit. So we're kind of East Coast centric a lot of the times, but we try and do as much as we can. And we really will do almost anything. We did a couple episodes right when we first started last year about the history of the heavyweight boxing title, or we'll do, give me your all time, 25-man roster for the Yankees, or we'll delve back and do let's talk about 100, we did a whole episode on 1920 in sports, or a whole episode on 1941 in sports. So the episode, it's funny, we talk about Philly. The episode that I'm currently editing, and I hopefully to have out at some point this week, was actually about the early 80s in Philly sports, specifically the year 1980, because between
that's a great topic there.
Between June of 80 and January of 81, all four Philly teams were in the championship game or series of their respective sports. Only the Phillies actually won, but Flyers, Eagles, and 76ers all lost. So that's what's coming up next. We tend to get a little verbose. So, this episode tops off at 2 hours and 15 minutes. So the editing has been a little bit of a process, but
I bet.
Yeah, no, the editing gets to be a little bit onerous, but it's fun. It's worth it. And then we got one. We actually just did a list of our all-time New York Giants team. We just did an offense and a defense and some special teams. And we got some other stuff coming up. I think we're looking probably to put out sometime in October. The NBA is in its 75th anniversary, and so we're going to try and do the sort of their NBA is going to do. They did their 50th anniversary team of 50 players 25 years ago, which I remember watching. And so they're going to do 75 this year. So we're going to come out with 75, our 75th anniversary team. We're not just going to go through and list all 75 players because we know that would get a little tedious, but we're going to assume that the Jordans and the Birds and the Russells and the Wilts are on everybody's list. And we're just going to kind of pick our last 25. And then the big thing that we do, and when I've done other podcasts on the network, I always like to mention this. We did it last year, and it's probably the ones that I'm the proudest of. We do what's called an in memoriam at the end of every year, where we look at all of or not to say all, because we're sure we missed some, but some of the biggest players and other sports figures who've passed away in the previous year. And
that's cool.
Yeah. Last year it was guys like Kobe and who else passed away? Lou Brock and but there was, obviously Casey Jones. I remember just anybody who passed away. Al Kaline. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch. And then this year we got guys like Elgin Baylor or Tommy Lasorda passed away at the very beginning of the year. Bobby Bowden from Florida, longtime Florida State coach. And we just do like short, 8 to 10 minutes on each. We had several of our Sports History Network colleagues come on to talk about one or two individuals that meant something to them or that were particularly interesting to them. So it was sort of a little bit of a collaborative effort. And we even, we had our dad on to talk about Dick Allen, who had been one of his favorite baseball players growing up in Philly. So we kind of like, we get fans of the show on, we get, other hosts on, family members, whatever. So it's he and I talking, but then it's also, it's just really cool. It's fun. It's the one that's kind of the most fun to put together, even though it's a little bit of a maudlin topic. And it's just a cool way to remember some of these guys, well-known guys, but then also, maybe guys, I went to Boston University and there was a Boston University hockey player that passed away, earlier this year or earlier, in 2020. So we talked about him. So it's kind of just a cool way to, talk about everybody from the big guys to maybe some lesser known. So we start recording that probably around Thanksgiving. And so that's something to look out for in December. So, all right.
But look, man, I really appreciate you coming on. And this was fun for me, doing it this morning. And, whenever you come back, you got an open invitation to come back on the show.
I appreciate it. And I have to say, just to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit, we're doing this at about 11:30 on a Sunday, on the 19th of September. So this is a cool way to kind of get ready to watch football all day too.
Oh man, you're right. And especially me, my team, I'm a Chargers fan. And if you haven't noticed the hat I'm wearing, I'm a huge Chargers fan, and we got a big game against Dallas later this afternoon. So I'm getting ready for that, but
mine already lost on Thursday night in Washington. The Giants were in Washington, and I was there, and it was disappointing. They lost by 1 point. So anyway,
I'm keeping my fingers crossed with my Chargers starting off 2-0. Hopefully, Dan, it was great having you on, man. And
it was great doing it.
You need me for anything, where to reach me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great, Dana. Thanks so much.
Hello, sports fans, and welcome back to the broadcast. This is Dana Auguster, and you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports podcast. And before we get on with the rest of the show, one sign that we're growing here at Historically Speaking Sports and the Sports History Network is right now we have a sponsor, and that sponsor is newspapers.com. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a serious sports fan like myself, and if you are into sports history, you need to check out newspapers.com. At newspapers.com, you can get access to over 640 million pages worth of news from the United States, Canada, England, Scotland, Ireland, and all of them dating back to the 1700s. To get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com, you could do that by visiting the sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. And with a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Also, check out our Twitter feed at HistoricallySP2 for your daily dose of sports history. And also, you could drop us a line or two at our email address, which is historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. And finally, don't forget to hit that subscribe button wherever you hear this podcast so you can get new episodes whenever they come out. And now, this week's Top 5. And this week's Top 5, if you're new here, what we do is we take the 5 events in the annals of sports history that celebrated anniversaries this past week. And today we're highlighting the events that took place between the dates of September the 15th to September the 22nd. Number 5. The New York Knickerbockers organized the rules of baseball. Now, before you get confused, I'm not talking about the New York Knickerbockers of the NBA. I'm talking about the very first organized baseball team that was based in Hoboken, New Jersey. In 1845, the New York Knickerbockers Baseball Club began to draw up the rules of baseball, which are still in use today. In the early years of the 19th century, the game was a combination of two British games, rounders, which was a children's game, and cricket, a stately game that had been played in England for a number of decades previous. After codifying the rules, which included the bases 90 feet apart, 3 outs in an inning, and no player was allowed to catch a ball in his cap, the Knickerbockers played the first real baseball game in history at the Elysian Fields in Hoboken, New Jersey. A year later, losing to a team called the New York Nine, 23-1 in just 4 innings. Now, if you make up the rules of baseball, you think you should be able to win the game, but in this case, not only did they lose, they basically got blown out. Number 4, Satchel Paige pitches 3 scoreless innings at the age of 59. Now, when it comes to baseball history, the name Satchel Paige is sort of relatable to the stories of Paul Bunyan, somewhat mythical. However, on September 25th, 1965, Paige added to his mythic stature by pitching 3 scoreless innings for the Kansas City Athletics against the Boston Red Sox. Paige allowed just 1 hit in 3 innings of work, a double to Red Sox outfielder Carl Yastrzemski in the first inning. Yet from that moment until he was taken out at the end of the 3rd inning to a rousing ovation, Paige was dominant. Not bad for a guy that was 59 years old. Number 3. The NFL players go on strike. Now I remember this because I was about 9 years old when this took place, and I was a big football fan as I am today, and this devastated me. On September the 21st, 1982, the NFL players went on strike that lasted 57 days. The strike occurred because the union demanded that wage scale based on the percentage of gross revenues be implemented. And the NFLPA wanted the percentage to be 55%, and according to the Los Angeles Times, this demand dominated the negotiations. As a result of the strike, the season schedule was reduced from 16 games to 9 games, and the playoff was expanded to 16 teams, 8 from each conference, for a Super Bowl tournament. A new 5-year agreement was finally ratified, providing severance packages to players upon retirement, an increase in salaries and postseason play, and bonuses based on the number of years of experience in the league. Additionally, the NFLPA was allowed to receive copies of all player contracts. Number 2, USA Basketball announces the Dream Team. As a result of losing to Russia in the 1988 Olympics and finishing with a disappointing bronze medal, the United States, with permission from the International Olympic Committee, put together the first U.S. basketball team that featured NBA players. On September the 21st, 1991, NBA players and one collegiate player, Deuce Christian Laettner, was named to the team. The NBA stars included Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Patrick Ewing, Charles Barkley, David Robinson, Scottie Pippen, John Stockton, Karl Malone, Clyde Drexler, and Chris Mullin. Team USA would go on to devastate the competition in the '92 Summer Games in Barcelona, Spain, cruising to a gold medal. And the number 1 event that took place this week in sports history, a base running error cost the New York Giants the pennant. In a crucial late regular season game at the Polo Grounds on September the 23rd, 1908, the Chicago Cubs and the New York Giants were battling for the National League pennant. Heading into the game, Giants first baseman Fred Taney was injured, and he was replaced by a rookie by the name of Fred Merkle. In the bottom of the 9th inning, with the game tied 1-1, with 2 outs, Giants catcher Moose McCormick was on third, representing the winning run, with Fred Merkle on first. Giants shortstop Al Bridwell centered into center field for a single. McCormick sprinted home, scoring easily. Giants fans was excited about the walk-off single and charged the field. Merkle, alarmed by the oncoming crowd, turned and headed for the clubhouse without touching second base. Johnny Evers, the Cubs' second baseman, saw Merkle hadn't touched second. If Evers could get the ball somehow and touch second, the run would be disallowed because of the force out. But he had to find the ball among the throng of people. The Cubs center fielder ran a scramble for the ball and threw it to Evers, who touched second base. Both teams declared victory, and it took National League Commissioner Harry Pulliam 3 days to declare the game a tie, and to hold a 1-game playoff if the 2 teams finished the season tied with record-wise. Both the Giants and Cubs finished the season with the same record. So on October the 8th, the Giants and Cubs met in that one-game playoff, and the Cubs, behind the pitching of Mordecai Three-Finger Brown, one of the coolest names in sports, by the way, defeated legendary Christy Mathewson and the Giants by the final score of 4-2. The Cubs would eventually win the World Series, beating the Boston Red Sox 4-1. And that concludes this week's Top 5. And coming up next, a shout out. And this week's shout out is a very special one because it talks about my favorite football team. Coming up next. Hello, welcome back to the show, and to wrap things up here on this episode of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, I'd like to go a little bit behind the curtain, I guess you should say, for this week's shout out. And I'm shouting out to a subject that is very near and dear to my own heart, and has been near and dear to my heart for, going on 40 years now, and that is actually over 40 years now that I think about it. My love affair with my favorite NFL team, and maybe my favorite team, actually it is my favorite team in any sport. And that is my fandom of the Los Angeles / San Diego Chargers. Now, you gotta understand, growing up in South Louisiana like I did in the late 1970s, you basically had 5 teams that you pretty much rooted for. First of all, living in Louisiana, of course, the Saints. But in the late 1970s, the Saints was in the middle of doing the era of the Aints, when people used to go to the Superdome wearing bags on their heads. So that wasn't a team for me. Then you had the other local teams, quote unquote. You had the Oilers, which was actually pretty good at the time with Dan Pastorini and Earl Campbell and head coach Bum Phillips. They were pretty good. But I really didn't gravitate towards them. The Dallas Cowboys, not so much, even though I did kind of like them until I reached the age of reason. And then I kind of turned away from them. Then you had the Pittsburgh Steelers, which was the kings of the NFL at the time, with Bradshaw, who was a Louisiana guy, Franco Harris, and their whole crew. But I just couldn't get with them. And last but not least, a lot of one of the teams that a lot of kids gravitated to in my age group was the Oakland Raiders, which was my dad's favorite team. And I couldn't root for the same team my dad does. So I guess, you know what? There was another team out in Southern California who seemed like they would score almost at will, was just score point after point after point after point. And I fell in love with them because they were so exciting to watch and so in a lot of high-scoring games. And that was the San Diego Chargers with Dan Fouts and Kellen Winslow, John Jefferson, Charlie Joyner, Chuck Muncie later came over from the Saints. And I fell in love with this team. And during the early 80s, during the heyday of Air Coryell, I was really right there front and center. Now, granted, you got to understand, this is the early 1980s now. And a lot of that game really didn't come on TV because I was living in Louisiana. But whenever they did come on TV, and they came on TV quite a bit because they were one of the best teams in the NFL at the time. And I just fell in love with them, especially with the lightning bolt and the colors and their exciting level, their exciting standard of play. I was just enamored by them. And through the years, I stuck with them. Even during the lean years of the 80s, when they had guys like Mark Vlasic at quarterback. He had Junior Seau, the superstar on defense, along with Leslie O'Neal, who should be in the Hall of Fame, by the way. You had other guys there, like Mark Vlasic was the quarterback. Later on, it was John Freese and those guys. Gary Anderson was a running back. Later on was Rod Bernstein and Marion Butts and, those guys. And I stuck with them throughout. Even though they had some very lean years during that time, I still was with them. Until the mid-1990s, and when things turned around, especially that magical season in 1994, when the Chargers finally got things together. They had this unbelievable start to the season. I think they started off 7-0 in 1994 and ended up going to the playoffs, beating the Steelers on a goal line stand to reach the Super Bowl, their only Super Bowl appearance, and which was the loneliest night of my life. Staying in the college dorm, watching the game in the lobby of the dorm, and being the only visible Charger fan there. That's a story for another day. But I stuck with them through thick and thin. I stuck with them during the Ryan Leaf era. And everybody that's a Charger fan, or at least an NFL fan, understand what that was like. And then in the early 2000s, after suffering through that miserable 2000 season when the Chargers went 1-15, we finally got two guys that we thought was going to be the bedrock of this franchise. One was Drew Brees, who later on, of course, went over to the New Orleans Saints. And LaDainian Tomlinson, in that when they traded away the number one pick, which would have been Michael Vick, traded into Atlanta to get the draft rights to get LaDainian Tomlinson and later on Drew Brees. And Brees hurt his shoulder, well documented, and so brought in Phillip Rivers. And from that point on, Chargers fans, Chargers, they've worked out well, they've played well, but unfortunately just could not get to the big game for whatever reason. Playoff futility, I guess you could call it. But through all of that, through thick and thin, I've been a Chargers fan and will be a Chargers fan for life. And that wraps up this week's show. I hope you all enjoyed the interview I had with Dan Neumann. Hope you enjoyed the top five, and of course, my rant and ravings about my fandom of the San Diego Chargers. So without further ado, I'd like to bid everyone a very fond farewell. And please, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and check us out on Twitter. One more time, that Twitter feed is historically SP2. So without further ado, I'd like to bid everyone a very fond farewell and have a great week, and we'll come back better than ever. See ya.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.